All right, I think I'm starting us off today. I don't know whether you can still see me, but I'll just go ahead.
We can see a little blurb of you.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So as we already briefly introduced, we'll be talking today about the reform of research assessments. And I'll be starting us off, first of all, with thinking a bit about the kind of takeaways that we would like you to take away from this presentation today. And so the first one of those takeaways is that reforming research assessment is actually a central lever to improving research culture on the one hand, and very much linked to that researchers' mental health. And I'll say a bit more about that in the next few minutes, but also to improving research quality more generally. And that really means, in effect, that healthy researchers and healthy research very much go hand in hand. A second message we'd hope you to take away today is that issues with researcher assessment are systematic. They're difficult to address. That's the one side of the story. The other side of that story is that actually there is currently, despite these challenges, a lot of momentum for change. And then a final message we'd like you to take away is that everyone in the research community can actually contribute to reforming research assessment, including individual researchers. If we then move kind of through to that first message, so that's really around the reforming research assessment being really central, or a central lever, first of all, to improving research culture. And that's the part I'll first say a bit more about. So what is research culture? So I come from a perspective where I was actually involved in probably the program that coined the term research culture initially at the Royal Society in 2018, or 2016 to 2018, I should say. It was a program ran over 2 years. And within that program, research culture was defined as encompassing the behaviors, the values, the expectations, but also attitudes and norms of research communities. And this influences the career paths of researchers, but also determines the way that research is conducted and communicated. And moving to another program by the Wellcome Trust, if we can, move to the next one. So the Wellcome Trust is another organization. This is, so the Royal Society, I should have said, is the National Academy of Science in the UK. The Wellcome Trust is a big funder of medical research. And they also, following the program at the Royal Society, did a program on research culture. And the way they expressed what it means is really how research is done. So the program I'm referring to here was really focused on imagining or reimagining how researchers work together and how that shapes the culture. They were really looking there also at a big survey of researchers to kind of understand what that culture is currently, but also how that could change in the future. And then if we move forward to the next slide, what was clear from both of those programs is that research culture is an umbrella term capturing a lot of different things. It captures things like the career of researchers, the kind of tension between collaboration and competition, but also their management relationships and other relationships. It covers inclusion and diversity, bullying and harassment, and it's kind of coincides with a lot of kind of behaviors and attitudes. Some of the words we've included here are safety, the workload, security, expectations, but also a sense of belonging. And I think I don't really need to convince anyone here that that all has an influence on the mental health and the well-being of researchers. So why did these programs want to look at research culture and how to improve it? If we move forward, there were really clear reasons behind why these organizations were looking at improving research culture. So Wellcome kind of formulated this kind of aim as countering negative impacts on researchers of poor culture. So they were very much focusing on the researcher and also improving research environments. And some of the poor research culture elements they were referring to were unhealthy competition, bullying and harassment, poor management practice, mental health issues, especially also one of those that is mentioned there that's relevant also for the audience today, but also impact on personal relationships, loneliness, for example. The Royal Society was much more focusing on negative consequences of culture on the quality of research itself, and this is a part where Noémie will say a lot more about in a few minutes. And they were referencing over-reliance on metrics, compromises on rigor and integrity, undervaluing of negative results, and also replication studies, but also lack of transparency and barriers to diversity and inclusion, and the direct links on the quality of research. So what were the outcomes of those programs? So they were really looking at, okay, through conversations with researchers and qualitative research, can we come to an understanding of how we can actually improve research culture? And a big finding from both programs was that actually for the Royal Society, they found that it's really the combination of highly competitive environments with the narrow definitions of success that is a root cause of poor research culture or issues with research culture. And Wellcome also had findings in the same direction. So this is a quote from Jeremy Farrar, the director of Wellcome, saying that the relentless drive for research excellence has created a culture in modern science that cares exclusively about what is achieved and not so much about the way in which it is achieved, how it is achieved. And that's how they defined culture at Wellcome. So the big takeaway here is that, and this is the point we wanted to make as a very first part of the first takeaway, is that broadening definitions of success has really emerged from these programs as a central lever to improving research culture. And as I said, there was also a big focus on quality. And I'll hand over here to Noémie to say a bit more about that specifically.
Thank you, Karen. So yeah, to go back to what Karen started with, so reforming research assessment is a central lever to improving research culture and to improving research quality. I will talk a little bit about my research, so mostly some findings from my PhD, in which I looked at research assessment and their impact on research and researchers. So the first point I want to make is the fact that the indicators that are used at the moment to assess researchers, they do not capture the elements that reflect high quality research and knowledge advancement. And I based this on some work that I've done through focus group and interviews that I did during my PhD. I interviewed stakeholders from the Flemish biomedical sciences, and I asked them, what is success in science? So I wanted to understand what's their views of success, what creates success in science. In my interviewees, I had some researchers from different levels of seniority, but I also had a whole array of different stakeholders. So I wanted to understand the differences in their perspectives. I won't go too much in the differences here, but I put the publications down there if you're interested in knowing more. So the first thing that I realized is that when I speak to researchers, to different stakeholders about success in science, some of them talk about success for research, but some of them also talk about success for careers. And these two ideas are quite different. When you talk about success for research, you talk about things that are valid, reproducible, strong findings, collaborative achievements, open science. But when you talk about successes for your career, then it was very different picture that people were telling me. They said, well, if I want to succeed in my career, then I have to focus on quantity. I have to create exceptional finding. It has to be individual because it has to be on my CV, and I have to remain competitive with my colleagues. All my results have to be positive as well. If it's negative, I have to abandon it because I don't have the time to pursue it. And if it's sensational and it goes to the news, it's even better. So there was a big difference here between research success and career success. I also interviewed some researchers who left academia, so researchers who came into academia and then they decided, it's not really for me, I want to leave. And their testimony was quite touching. I had a lot of understanding that they felt quite often like a failure. They felt like they were not good enough for academia, even though we know that there's very few chances that these people could stay in academia forever. But some concepts that they brought up, and this is not new, but they brought up the fact that there's huge pressure on researchers, lack of time. Researchers are pressured to produce outputs, but they don't really have time to do it well. For example, in this quotation, don't have time to read each other people's work. There's also precarity. So researchers feel that if they don't perform and if they don't publish a lot, they risk losing their jobs. And they have to outperform their peers to stay in their job. And there's a lot of competition also linked to the precarity. And the researchers who left academia were very vocal about the fact that this influenced their decision to leave, that there was too much competition in the system. I also have some findings from a small-scale survey that I conducted with researchers still in Belgium, so during my PhD, with respondents who are mostly from Flemish research institutions. And in that survey, I asked respondents, I gave them a bunch of statements, and I asked them for each of these statements, how important is this in advancing your career, in advancing science, or to your personal satisfaction? And I won't go into all the results because it could take me quite a while, but I just want to show some trends. So on the one hand, there are indicators that were seen as very important in advancing science, but not so much in advancing careers. And these indicators, when you look at them and you try to find common points in these indicators, well, they tended to be linked to openness, transparency, quality, and innovation. Other indicators were more important in advancing careers, but not so much in advancing science. And these tended to be related to luck, prestige, status, and competition. So we already see a difference here. Then another thing that I found through my research is that capturing the elements that reflect high quality research requires broadening the indicators used to assess researchers. And Karen will go back into that, but from my work, I also found hints of this from what people were telling me. So first, when I was discussing with, especially with researchers, but also with other stakeholders, it became clear that when you're a researcher, you have very different tasks. You do a lot of different things. You wear a lot of different hats, sometimes too many hats, and people don't really know where to put all their efforts. But there's a lot of tasks involved in being a researcher. For example, you need to peer review, you need to network, you need to mentor, to apply your results. It goes in all directions. But when it comes to research assessment, the only thing that really matters is then the publication. In some fields, the patents, and sometimes a bit of the funding acquisition. But it's really focusing on the outputs, publications in particular. So that's problematic because it leads to a very homogeneous and limited view of researchers' work, and it leaves no room for diversity. And I also found something similar to that from a broader scale survey that was conducted as part of a research team that I'm on the project SUBS for RI. It's a European Commission project. And we conducted a broad scale survey that was coordinated by Nick Allum and Abigail Reid in Essex. It was a big survey, so there was about 50,000 participants. And the survey was on all topics of research integrity, but there was one question that I think is relevant here. So we asked the survey respondents, when a researcher's performance is being evaluated by an employer or a potential employer, how important do you think it is to include each of the following activities in making an assessment of their performance? And then we included societal impact, teaching, leadership, editorship of journals, supervisory responsibilities, outreach, peer review, publication metrics, collegiality, and participation in research integrity training. That was part of the question for our project. And what we found is the following, but what's really interesting is that there are some of these indicators that were found to be very important. So most respondents found these indicators to be very important in assessing researchers. Leadership, supervisory responsibility, peer review, and collegiality. So these are not research outputs, and these are at the moment largely absent from current research assessments. And that leads me to the last point, which is a bit unfortunate, but we understand that there's a problem with the system and we need to change research assessment, but it is difficult to change research assessments because it's a systematic issue. So it's something that has to do with reshaping a whole system. So the last question I would ask my participants in the focus group and the interviews that I was doing was, okay, so we have all these problems now, who's responsible? Who has to change this, and what can you do? What can you change? And I found that everybody tended to blame everybody. So it was very complicated and nobody felt able to change. And that's for a number of reasons. But the reasons that I really got out of there is that everybody's dependent on each other. So different stakeholders are dependent on different stakeholders. There's incompatibilities in what people want. And most importantly, there's a fear of a first mover's disadvantage. So people think if we change our research assessment, we're not going to be competitive anymore. And as part of that, the ranking and the league tables have a big role, and Karen will get back to that later. So it is difficult to address research assessment, but let's stay positive. There's actually currently a momentum for change. And there is really a lot happening. I put just one page of declarations, movements, initiatives that are happening. I could have done that page at least 10, 15, 20 times. So there's really a momentum for change. And today we want to talk about one of these one of these statements, which is the agreement towards a reform of research assessment and the coalition that was built from it. So the agreement was a joint effort from EUA, European Universities Association, the European Commission, and Science Europe, together with Karen Stroobans, who was really the pen behind the whole agreement. And so together they worked with a core group from which I was part, and an assembly of over 350 stakeholders, a lot of them being research institutions. So on this, I leave it to Karen.
Thanks, Noémie. And so as Noémie already introduced, there were already a lot of initiatives, I think already for at least the ones that I've been really following, I think started more than 10 years ago now. So while there was already some momentum for advocating for change, there was a feeling, I think, in the community that had been trying to push it, that progress had been relatively slow. And also, I think there was suddenly really increased momentum in Europe, because there was a link with suddenly some of the other agendas. It was understood that pushing the agenda for open science, but also trying to make progress on inclusion and diversity was actually being hampered, or kind of assessment was being seen as a barrier for that. And so it's clear that that has kind of generated extra momentum, where there was a willingness from the EU side to build on existing initiatives, but also go beyond some of those, and go beyond declarations towards formulating more what we want for the future and setting quite a concrete timeline on that. And so in the spring, autumn of 2021, the Commission consulted European stakeholders on how to facilitate and speed up changes. And that had actually resulted in a scoping report. So that was one of the reports on the previous slides, formulating common principles for advancing research assessment. And so it's actually at that point that I became involved, because I was actually in part of that stakeholder consultation on behalf of the Marie Curie Alumni Association. And I was asked at that point to support bring together the agreement. And the agreement, the purpose of the agreement was really to translate the principles in that initial scoping report that had already inputs from lots of stakeholders into very concrete commitments that could set a shared direction for a coalition of all those willing to work to implement change in research assessment. And then before I move more into what that agreement looks like, I did want to say something more about the drafting process. Noémie already briefly touched on it, but I think it's important to realize that this agreement was not written by one person or even by a small group of people. It was really a co-creation effort. So Noémie already showed the organizations involved in that drafting team. So European University Association, Science Europe, the European Commission as facilitator, and myself. But part of our job was really to seek inputs from a lot of other stakeholders, including member state representatives, the core group that Noémie was part of, together with 19 other stakeholders. And then also all those that had said they want to be involved already had agreed with the principles in the scoping report and wanted to be involved in co-creating this. And that in the end was over 350 organizations. And I can attest to the fact that the inputs of all those stakeholders have been taken very seriously, because that was mostly my job, and it was quite a big job. And that led to an iteration of drafts, and then eventually the final agreement published in July. And then if we move forward, this is just, I'm going to touch on a few aspects of the agreement, not all of it, because we wouldn't have the time now. But just first on the left, there's just an overview of the different elements of the agreement. It has an introduction to set the tone. It repeats the principles. So those are those principles that were in the scoping report that people had already agreed on when they started actually on drafting the rest of the agreement. It then, and this for me is really the core of the agreement, has a series of 10 commitments. That's the part I'll say a bit more about in a minute. It also sets out principles for a coalition to bring together all those who want to then implement the commitments, and it sets a time frame. So it asks to show progress after 1 and 5 years. Those are the touch points from signing. And then it has a few annexes to support in terms of content. So coming back to those core commitments, the real core of the agreement, I'll just say a bit more about those. So the two first ones are really to enable better recognition of the diverse practices and activities that maximize the quality of research. The first one of those, to recognize the diversity of contributions to and careers in research. And I think both Noémie and I will be very happy to see that as the first one, because it addresses most of the things we've actually been talking about so far in this presentation. And a second one asks to then base research assessment primarily on qualitative evaluation. That those two commitments about the shared direction for the future are balanced with two commitments around what we maybe want to move away from in the future. One around abandoning inappropriate uses in research assessment of journal and publication-based metrics, and then also one on avoiding the use of rankings of research organizations in research assessment. And then if we move on, those core commitments are supported by 6 supporting commitments. I won't run through those in detail, but 3 of those are really to pilot and enable the move towards new types of criteria, tools, and processes. And there's an emphasis there on involving researchers at all career stages, so including early career stages in that process of developing those, but also on awareness raising and making sure that everyone understands very transparently what criteria look like. And then there are also 3 commitments to facilitate mutual learning and communicate progress. And again, there's a focus there on avoiding unintended consequences, ensure that assessment is evolutive. And I think there's a role as well for early career researchers to help keep an eye on that and be involved in that aspect. And then just to say something more about this coalition that I already mentioned. So a lot of the work that is ongoing now, because the agreement was published in July and has been open for signature since end of September. So a lot of what's going on now is really a focus on bringing together stakeholders via what has been named the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, or the COARA. And so the work of the COARA is envisioned very much via working groups operating as communities of practice. And it's written into the rules of procedure for those working groups that can involve inviting experts that are not necessarily part of those organizations that are signed off. So this is really to provide also a route to be able to invite, for example, early career researchers where it seems appropriate to sense check things with them, also linked to those unintended consequences I talked about. The COARA will see complementarities and synergies. So a lot of this is really around learning from each other, but also sharing and making sure we don't put any new barriers, for example, to the mobility of researchers. And so this is kind of progressing quite fast now because the Constitutive Assembly, so this is the launch of the coalition, the official launch, will take place on the 1st of December. And then, so that brings me a bit to how everyone in the research community can contribute. And I think there's obviously contributions within the COARA, but also outside of that. And I want to go back to the slide Noémie showed, because I think the kind of all the different or kind of things that are already happening are really it shows the diversity of the number of organizations that are already involved. And if you would kind of go zoom in on all of these, you'd see that there are funders, there are bottom-up researcher organizations, there are universities, there are university associations. So there's already loads of stakeholders across the sector who are engaged in this. Thinking back again now about who can be involved in the COARA, and I think I put something on that on the next slide. Yes. So the COARA will be a combination mostly of the organizations in the blue boxes. So it will be a coalition of organizations rather than individuals, inviting institutions, funders, researcher associations. And I'm summarizing here a bit because the full list is a bit broader. It really includes all organizations involved in assessment. Some governments might be able to also join, and this will depend a bit on how direct their role is in assessment, but there are some ministries and some departments that directly assess research, so those can also be invited. And also, to be very clear, this is supposed to be a global initiative, so while it started in Europe, this will be open to all the organizations of this nature worldwide. And then researchers, so individuals, will not be able to join directly, but of course there is an expectation that all these organizations will communicate with individual researchers and seek their inputs throughout this process. So there is of course a role for them. And then moving forward to the kind of final the final question around this. So how can individual researchers not just contribute to the COARA, but more generally to reforming research assessment? And I think there's actually quite a few ways in which they can do that, which we've also lined out for you. So I think the first one is really that researchers can definitely, first of all, join the conversation and start to talk about this topic within their own environment. And one example through which people could do this are the cafe culture toolkits that Wellcome Trust developed as part of their program. So this is a toolkit to enable discussions around culture and assessment at their own institution. I think we can distribute these slides after, and there's a link in this slide actually to find out more about that. There's also, of course, a lot of people who are doing research, Noémie, one of them, who rely on the inputs of researchers to actually progress some of this work from that side. So I think it's also important to share insights and opinions where there are opportunities to either work with researchers who work in the research on research area, but also it could be learned societies that are gathering information. It could be programs like the one Wellcome and Royal Society did. So, you know, the more people participate in that, the third suggestion is to contribute to changing expectations. So And that can really help shape what success means. One example I like to always mention is that through our conversations, we really set the tone. For example, I remember even being very passionate about changing assessment, being when I was still a researcher a few years ago, automatically almost when someone told me they had published a publication, I would almost by automatic kind of without thinking ask them, where did you publish it? The first question would be about the journal. And now I don't do that anymore. I try to very consciously forbid myself to make that the first question or even a question at all. And I always ask about the results. What does it mean? You know, what do you see the next steps are? So make it much more about the content. So that's one way in which, maybe a small way in which we all can make quite a big difference, I think, if we change the conversations. The next one is to become an ambassador for change. So I think there are usually strong advocates for, I think for open science, we've definitely seen that, but there's also programs for really becoming ambassador of change. I think eLife has quite a good program, for example, where early career researchers can really build that together. And then also, of course, a very important one, consider broad criteria when you are assessing research, because many researchers at some point will start to become involved, even in maybe in small ways, in assessing, maybe in peer review or in other forms or in recruitment, and that is your chance to implement some of the responsible assessment principles. So that's I think a key one. And then I think a very final one is to just say that, you know, we are all part of the problem, but we can also all be part of the solution. So I think that's a good note to end on and open up for discussion. Sorry, yeah, we're repeating the takeaways. That's important, Noémie. Thanks for putting that up there. So what we've gone over today is, first of all, to kind of show that reforming research assessment is really a lever for both improving culture, the culture of research, but also the quality of research, and that healthy researchers and healthy research go hand in hand. Second, that issues with researcher assessment are systematic, they are difficult, they are complex. However, there is momentum for change. And finally, everyone, including you, everyone who's here, can contribute to reforming research assessment. And that's where we really end.
Delightful. Thank you so much. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording now. There are a couple of questions in the chat, so we could start with those, and then people can also raise their hand and unmute and ask questions. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.